As with most things in life, there are rare exceptions. As I said earlier, some leaders of very small triangles do good work. In theory, leadership is a reasonable idea. In theory, it could be a very efficient way of making good decisions. But the key word here is good. Good for whom? If the decisions being made were for the benefit of other people or other living creatures who need help, or for the benefit of society as a whole, or for the benefit of our suffering environment, then it could be that well-informed leaders could make good decisions. No doubt that in the case of small triangles, this sort of leadership does sometimes happen. But the evidence of thousands of years of human history proves that as far as big triangles are concerned, this is certainly not what happens. As I've already shown, the evidence proves that the vast majority of supposedly great leaders are motivated by one thing and one thing only, their own personal advantage. As millions of ordinary people suffer in silence, together with billions of other powerless living creatures, as our life-sustaining planet slowly and needlessly dies before our very eyes, our great trusted leaders are forever getting richer and caring not a fig for anyone but themselves. Although many, perhaps most of those who aspire to be leaders begin their careers for the best of reasons and start out as good leaders, they soon discover that promotion towards the top of the triangle is wholly dependent on them sacrificing the values that first might have made them good leaders. They soon learn that morality and leadership are wholly incompatible things. You can be a moral person or you can be a high and mighty leader, but you can't be both. This is not just my opinion. Consider these words. We are bred up to feel it a disgrace ever to succeed by falsehood. We will keep hammering along with the conviction that honesty is the best policy and that truth always wins in the long run. These pretty little sentiments do well for a child's copybook, but a man who acts on them had better sheath his sword forever. That was said by a very high and mighty leader, Sir Garnet Wolseley, who was the Commander-in-Chief of the British Army in the days when the British Empire controlled a quarter of the planet. Wolseley's words prove that for these great leaders, morality in the form of truth and honesty is no more than a pretty little sentiment, suitable only for a child's copybook. Because this is how nearly every powerful country works, how every so-called great empire has ever worked, how every supposedly great leader and statesman thinks, it's very tempting to think it must obviously be the best way to do things, how every organisation should be modelled, to think, perhaps, there is no alternative. But is that really the case? Of course it isn't. I'm prepared to accept that in a very tiny minority of situations, the presence of a good leader making good and effective decisions quickly can indeed be the best way to organise a group of people, such as in life and death situations, where fast and correct decision-making will be the difference between whether someone lives or dies. But that is about the only type of situation where a good leader might be really beneficial. Given the obvious fact that for the daily routines of the vast majority of humanity, life and death situations are exceptionally rare events, so it therefore follows that in the overwhelming majority of situations, leaders are simply not necessary. Another very effective and, in most cases, better method of decision-making is decision-making by consensus. In other words, by including all of the people involved in whatever decision needs to be made, and through a process of providing good information and open discussion, arriving at a decision that meets with the approval of most of those taking part. Of course, it is invariably slower than having one person making dictatorial decisions, but is unquestionably a better method most of the time. Why do I think that? Firstly, I've already shown that leaders cannot be trusted, especially powerful leaders. In fact, the more powerful a leader is, the less they can be trusted. Secondly, even the best leaders in the world are capable of making genuine mistakes and errors of judgment. Thirdly, generally speaking, most of us tend to trust decisions made by a majority of well-informed people more than decisions made by a minority. This is, after all, the basis of one of the most ancient and well-supported cornerstones of society, trial by jury. Although far from perfect, and sometimes demonstrably wrong, most of us instinctively trust a system of justice, where the question of guilt or innocence is decided in an open court by groups of ordinary people, just like us, rather than by some sort of elitist leader figure. People who have been conditioned to accept leadership not only as the normal way of organising groups of people, but as the best way to organise others, find it difficult to accept that there may be another way of doing things, let alone the possibility there might be a better way of doing things. That sort of thinking is perfectly understandable. That's how brainwashing is supposed to work. Let's now consider the phenomenon of leadership in a far more everyday context. Millions of people work in the public sector, which could be seen as a collection of large triangles of organisation, each of which comprises a multitude of small and medium-sized triangles. I used to lead one of these small triangles, so I have some excellent first-hand experience of how the system operates. The department I worked in, the Employment Service, was a pretty big triangle, consisting of many smaller triangles, each with their own leader figure serving as some sort of manager. These managers had far less stressful lives than the lowly workers at the base of the triangle, who did all the real work of the department, and they were all paid far more money than the real workers. The funny thing was, however, that when these managers, these overpaid leaders who were deemed so crucial to the organisation, whenever these people were absent from the office, which was quite often, no one really noticed. Yet whenever one of the real workers was away, a real difference was often felt. And if 2 or 3 were away at the same time, chaos would often result, with longer queues of people waiting much longer to be seen, and staff stress levels going through the roof. Whole groups of officers could be without their managers at the same time, and often were, and no one knew the difference. But if a few real workers from any one office were missing at the same time, semi-panic could ensue. So I first suspected the pointlessness of all these overpaid leaders very early on in my civil service career. And then one day, I had the perfect chance to prove it. My leader, our office manager, went on holiday and offered me the opportunity to deputise for her. I would get the chance to spend 2 weeks doing her job. It really was something of an eye-opener, for I quickly discovered that the main duty that needed to be done every day was to deal with her morning post. Once that was seen to, and I don't think it ever took me more than an hour, usually it was far less. After the morning post was out the way, there was literally nothing to do, apart from occasionally sign a piece of paper if one of my colleagues needed the signature of an office manager. My normal job, as leader of a small team of administrators, was trivial enough when compared with those administrators who dealt directly with the public all day long. But my normal job was a veritable hive of industry when compared with the office manager's job. I wondered what her boss did for a living, and his boss, and all the other bosses right up to the top of the employment service triangle, all of whom were paid vast sums of money relative to the people who really mattered, the ordinary lowly paid administrators at the bottom of the triangle who worked directly with the public all day long, delivering the service the public paid for. The great myth of leadership really is a myth. This is not to suggest all these bosses do absolutely nothing all day long. They all actually do something that's not only useful, but essential. They provide a line of communication between others in the wider organisation. But the point is that this vital function usually takes up only a very small part of the working day, and, more to the point, any ordinary administrator could do it. It most certainly does not require a rising hierarchy of grossly overpaid, self-interested individuals with ever-increasing delusions about their importance to society in general and their own organisation in particular. But of course we all know how our trusted leaders would respond to this truth about them. They would tell us, there is no alternative. That without leaders, society would simply collapse into chaos. Like almost everything else our great trusted leaders tell us, that too is a lie. As I showed earlier, our planet is already in chaos, not for want of leaders, but because of them. Of course, this argument seems completely counterintuitive. It seems that way because we're conditioned to think that way, that we absolutely must have leaders telling us what to do every waking moment of our lives. It's a lie. There are alternatives. There are much better alternatives. I mentioned that my job in the civil service was team leader, so some might say I'm being hypocritical. Well, I don't think so, because I used to do things rather differently from most of my fellow team leaders. Far from being supreme decision maker for my team, the normal and expected function of a team leader, I almost never made decisions on their behalf. What I did instead was provide the time and space and that all-important ingredient, good information, so my team could make their own decisions, which they did through a process of open discussion and consensual decision-making. It worked like a dream. When I was first appointed to the position of team leader, I inherited 10 very experienced but highly disgruntled workers, who were a team in name only. They were people who had been suffering under conventional leadership for many years. When I was forced to move on to another job some 18 months later because of the way I worked, I left behind a highly effective team whose morale was second to none because, for the first time ever, they had been given the chance to organise themselves and make their own decisions. Apart from facilitating this process once a week, which any one of them could have done, I was redundant, completely unnecessary. That's why I know, without doubt, that leaders are irrelevant, because I've been one and known I was unnecessary. All that's needed for groups of people to arrive at their own decisions and organise themselves is that they have the time and space to meet and discuss, and, most important, that they have good information. That this system of collective decision-making is vastly superior to the traditional leader-based model we're conditioned to accept is also beyond doubt. And it's beyond doubt because of that all-important and ancient Roman question, qui bono, who benefits? A close inspection of who benefits from any particular event or action is always a useful exercise. And the subject of leadership is not only no exception to this rule, it's a glittering example of why we should do it. Because when we consider who benefits most from our existing system of leadership, what do we find? We find that it's leaders themselves who benefit the most. The most obviously glaring example of this is one I've already used. The fact that just 85 leaders have more personal wealth than the combined wealth of 3.5 billion non-leaders, half the planet's population. If we return to the triangle analogy, here we have a huge triangle with 85 people grouped near the tip of it and 3.5 billion ordinary people struggling for survival at the very bottom. Many of those who comprise the other 3.5 billion are a vitally important part of this monstrous injustice, because they are the multitude of little leaders who don't concern themselves with the condition of those at the base of the triangle, or anything else for that matter. The main driving force of these people is personal ambition, a demented, impossible dream of becoming one of the 85 themselves. And the further they climb towards the peak of the triangle, kicking and gouging and crushing their competitors, the less they care about the condition of the people at the base. All these little leaders are encouraged in their selfish dreams by the simple device of financial incentives and fear. It's the old carrot and stick principle. They're forever chasing the bigger carrot of more personal riches, at the same time as looking over their shoulder in terror at the stick beating those who must get by on less. None of these fine and overpaid leaders are actually necessary to society. From the most junior team leader or supervisor, all the way up through the triangle of injustice to the top 85 themselves, none of them are necessary. Not only are they not necessary, they and the system they perpetuate are the primary cause of the monstrous evil that permits just 85 people to own more personal wealth than 3.5 billion other human beings, who, in all other respects, are absolutely no different to them, except that they are mostly far more decent human beings. So what can we do about it? The first and most important step is to clearly understand this simple fact. Leadership is grossly overrated. I'll end this part of my talk at this point. In the next part, I'll go on to explain more about leaderless organisation and why it is far, far superior to our existing leader-based systems.